want to know what you're fighting for. Podcast for George. 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 Oh, yeah.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Got a big story. We're making big news here in the Heartland, and it ain't the kind of news that you want to make, folks. And it leads to our guest today, which is Adam Mason with Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. And let me read this story first of all that kind of prompted the podcast and bringing Adam on. This is by Danielle Eller. Out of the Des Moines Register, agricultural runoff puts Iowa's Raccoon River on the list of 10 most endangered nationally, group says. A runoff from livestock facilities and farm fields poses a grave threat to the Raccoon River, a major drinking water source for 500,000 Des Moines metro residents, placing it among the nation's 10 most endangered waterways for 2021. A new report says. Okay, I just want to remind folks that I think we're number 9 on this list. There are 40,000 miles, or kilometers rather, of waterways in the United States, and the Raccoon River has hit number 9 on this list. It's the first time the Raccoon River, which runs from northwest Iowa to Des Moines, has been placed on the annual Most Endangered Rivers list from American Rivers, an influential Washington, D.C. environmental advocacy nonprofit that has been producing the list since 1986. We're sounding the alarm because pollution in the Raccoon River is putting drinking water supplies and public health at risk, said Olivia Dorothy, American Rivers Upper Mississippi River Mason Director. Okay, so we're number 9, and this isn't going to come as any surprise to our guest, who is Adam Mason. Let's get him on in here. Adam, welcome into a podcast by George.
Hey, George, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, and I wanted to start with your kind of retort or your response to this, because you got an extremely well-written, and I love to have these written pieces on the podcast. We'll kind of read along and follow it. Every word in these is important. I know this because of my journalism background. I know this because of my marketing background. When you write something, you have to think of every single word, and every word in this is important. It starts off, Raccoon River designation underscores that Iowa's water crisis demands federal attention. And you write that Iowans across the state deserve clean, safe drinking water in a system that puts our health and safety above the benefit of corporations. And it was written along with Emma Schmidt. She's an organizer with the Food and Water Watch and lives up in Rockwell City. And you write that it comes as no surprise to the hundreds of thousands of people who live in the Raccoon River watershed that the river was just named one of the most endangered in the country, sacrificed for the benefit of corporate agribusiness and distant shareholders. Okay, I wanted to stop right there, Adam, and bring you in to talk about that, because people don't realize this. We hear about Smithfield and companies like this, and we think, well, yeah, that's that company that's over there in Ottumwa or up there in Fort Dodge or in some city in Iowa or maybe in the Midwest or what. No, Smithfield is Chinese owned. What we're doing here with these businesses is benefiting companies that aren't across the street, across the state, across the country. They're across the world from us.
That's right. And, it is just a handful of these companies. When you think about Smithfield and a lot of these livestock companies, 4 livestock companies control over 80% of the meat market. When you add in on top of that, a handful of chemical companies that are putting out the chemical fertilizers that are getting dumped on our farm fields. Again, that's just a few companies, lots of shareholders profiting off of this pollution.
Well, you go on to write here to continue. You say we can do something about it by demanding that the federal government do its job. Okay, and this is kind of maybe the overarching part of the podcast and my show and kind of where I'm at. I am disgusted with the political process in the United States, like a lot of people are. You can demand this of the federal government, but my God, what I'm seeing in the federal government doesn't show me that they're likely to respond to anything in an intelligent way. We just had 75 million red-blooded Americans vote for Donald Trump. They just crawled through the windows at the federal Capitol building out there in January. As far as here in Iowa, our congressional delegation, the lone Democrat now, is Cindy Axne, and how much she can or will do is subject to question, Adam. I wanted you to talk about that a little bit, because if she's going to be up for re-election here in like the representatives are in 2022, if she's to win, she may win by a few hundred votes Literally, that's what that contest has come down to. So she's got to be very careful how she treads. And that's not good for causes like yours. I don't know if she can or she will be a champion for you on these types of issues. What's your take on that?
Well, we do have an uphill fight. There's no doubt about that. But what we do know is our state government, Governor Reynolds and the Iowa DNR have been failing us for well over a decade now. Governor Branstad and now Governor Reynolds have made it clear they want to do nothing but deregulate this industry. So I would say that we are cautiously hopeful because, with a new Biden administration and a new head of the EPA, we think this is an opportunity to get to our congressional delegation, to get to the EPA, and to actually try and start changing things there. Now, I will say, I hear you 100% about the Iowa delegation. The one thing, the issue of water, is that there is no red water or blue water in Iowa, right? It's pretty dirty. And kind of to the bigger point of the federal government, I agree with you. We hear a lot about big government versus small government. And for us at Iowa CCI, it's less a question about big or small. It's about who is government going to work for. And that's the challenge we have right now, is to make government work for everyday folks who care about clean water across the political spectrum instead of these big corporations.
Well, and let's talk about that a little bit in the state of Iowa, because I just had Laura Bellin on with Bleeding Heartland, and she's talking about some of the controversy, some of the stuff in the governor's office, hard to believe. And we were talking about the, newly appointed Iowa Director of Natural Resources, who has no background in natural resources whatsoever. Her experience really consisted of being a lobbyist for Big Ag. That's who the head of the Iowa DNR is currently. And you go on to write that the state of Iowa has relied heavily on industry-friendly voluntary approaches to reducing agriculture pollution in rivers and lakes. Unsurprisingly, it has failed. It's kind of funny almost, but it isn't funny. But this voluntary compliance thing is really a big problem. It is a joke. And to put it into real world context, the argument that you often hear, and it's right, if speed limits were voluntary on the interstates, you'd have people driving around 100 miles an hour. If paying taxes were voluntary, wouldn't anybody be doing it? Well, the same is true when it comes to protecting the environment in Iowa.
That's exactly right. And so, again, the examples that you just laid out are perfect examples, ones that I like to use a lot. And if we look at our water quality and our environment, the reason that we have the Clean Water Act is because in the 70s, rivers were literally being lit on fire because they were so polluted. And so we have the Clean Water Act because folks knew that if we wanted to clean up our water, we needed some regulations. Now, what's happened over time is agriculture as an industry is exempted from those regulations. And if it was just, family farms and Farmer Joe and Farmer Jane out there with a small farm doing the right things, we wouldn't have the problems that we have. But unfortunately, the concentration of land and this industry has just gotten so pervasive that we need to do more than this voluntary approach.
Well, I want to show folks this map so they know what we're talking about. I'm a little late in getting this up, actually, but this is the Raccoon River. This is the watershed, the environment that Adam is talking about. When not that many years ago in the state of Iowa, this was kind of a bog. It was all tiled, and it is now all farmland. And the runoff, that's the other thing I wanted you to talk about, because even the Register article, they have to be nuanced, but people call it runoff and they call it nitrates. My wife will be the first one to remind everybody what we're talking about here, folks, mostly is pig shit. I can say that on the podcast because it's my podcast. It's Podcast by George. But that's the primary culprit here. There are farm chemicals that are involved also. But to just say that it's runoff makes it sound like it's much less of a stinky problem, literally, than it actually is. That's what's in our water. And it's in our well water for anybody that's in a rural area on a well.
That's right. The Des Moines Waterworks gets a lot of attention because they're providing drinking water for 500,000 Iowans here in central Iowa. But there's over 30,000 farm families that are still drinking well water, and those wells go untested. Now, I want to go back to what you said there initially. You're absolutely right. This industry likes to say that hog shit is a valuable nutrient, right? That they would never waste it. But if that were true, we wouldn't see commercial fertilizer use remaining constant or actually slowly creeping up. Because we have over 10,000 factory farms in the Raccoon River watershed, we have over 750 of those alone. So what we end up having is just billions of gallons of liquid manure that's being dumped, untreated onto these farm fields in the fall and in the spring. When do we have a lot of rain? In the fall when we're getting snow, and in the spring when we get those spring rains. It's pushing it all off the land, seeping down into these tile lines and running into our waterways.
It's a problem that's getting exponentially worse. Couple of things, maybe you can clarify on this. We're primarily in drought. It gets broken by torrential downpours and floods because of the climate crisis or climate emergency that we're currently involved in, because of this tiling system that we're talking about, and because of the storms that we have. This all runs off, and the problem is much worse than it's ever been. And is it accurate to think that because there is less water in the Raccoon right now, as an example, is it becoming increasingly toxic because of the runoff that goes in it?
Yeah, what we've heard, and I think what scientists are telling us is that because of this concentration and the low water levels, when you do have a rain event, it's pushing more of that runoff into our streams and rivers, and then you have the low flow, so you're seeing higher concentrations of nitrate. The other thing that's happening is when we have droughts combined with those high temperatures, you get slower water. And that slower water is more prone to algae blooms, which are going to create microcystins and other toxins, which then take a whole different treatment process. And if you've ever gone, I mean, you shouldn't, but if you've ever gone swimming near an algae bloom, you might get a rash. We've heard really sad stories of folks going swimming, kids getting very sick, dogs dying from entering this kind of polluted water. It really is a public health risk.
Well, and I appreciate your insight on this. The podcast, we're only limited to about 20 minutes or so. There's only so much of this that we can get into, and I'm very interested in any solution that we can have here. And in your article, you're mentioning that the EPA should be involved in this. The EPA is a great idea. It should. Of course, it had its legs taken out from under it under the Trump administration. Maybe Biden's going to turn that around. Can the EPA solve any of this, do you think? And if so, how long will it take?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start with your last question there. Is we know we didn't get in this problem overnight, so we're not going to get out of it overnight either. It's going to take a while. But what we can't do is nothing. If we continue to do nothing, if we continue to deregulate, this water quality, this water crisis that we're in is only going to continue to get worse. So, we are focusing on the EPA right now, asking them to come in and help us fully enforce the Clean Water Act as it applies to industrialized agriculture. Going back to that voluntary nutrient reduction strategy you talked about, It's not working. We're seeing about 2 to 3% of farms implementing some kind of conservation practices.
Has the EPA changed enough yet that they'll be able to help, or they'll be willing to help? Contacting the EPA just a couple of years ago would have been like throwing a horseshoe down a well, as you well know. I mean, can they help with this or not?
They can. The EPA actually has oversight authority over the Iowa DNR. They give the power to the DNR to enforce the Clean Water Act in the state. Back in 2007, we actually petitioned the EPA, very similar to what we're doing right now. And they actually had to step in 2011 and 2012 to investigate Iowa DNR. And what they found was that Iowa DNR was not enforcing the rules and regulations on these factory farms. So over about 5 years, we saw some modest improvements while the EPA was watching, but they signed off on our complaint in 2018, 2019. So what we're doing now, again, especially because of this, most endangered river status that the Raccoon River is under now, we're continuing to sound the alarm and hopeful that the new administration, again, will give us a little bit more time and a little bit more pressure on the state of Iowa to do better.
Well, good on you, and thanks for fighting the good fight. And here's the thing, and maybe put on your political hat a little bit. I want to kind of get your take on this, your feel, because I'm starting to gravitate and move even more to the left, and I'm very interested at this point in a movement for a People's Party, maybe a left-wing party to come along. And the reason for that is not because I think that they're going to win and change the world anytime soon, but basically in my lifetime, Adam, because of Ronald Reagan, mostly back in the 80s, the Democratic Party has moved progressively right. Those Reagan Democrats and those right-wing independents moved with Reagan to the right. And the Democratic Party has been chasing them ever since to try to defeat the Republicans. And that's resulted in the Democratic Party becoming more right-wing. In the situation that I cited exactly with Cindy Axne, I mean, she can't become a left-wing progressive here. She has to be very careful because she's only going to win by a few hundred votes if she wins. Do you think there's any prospect for a left-wing party? Do you support that kind of thing at Iowa CCI? And can that start to bring the balance of power back from where it's gone so far to the crazy train right side of the political spectrum?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in that because you're absolutely right. The shift that we've seen to the right to pro-corporate policies has come because Reagan put that marker out there, right? And since then, right-wing politicians in the Republican Party have continued to push that marker that they're fighting for further to the right. We absolutely need to be doing the same thing on the left, looking at the big, bold, progressive policies, again, that we know are going to make our communities better because of what we're living through right now. So we need to put those markers out there and keep fighting for that to draw the conversation back to the left. I think one of the reasons that we saw President Trump was so successful in Iowa was because he was actually using a very populist pitch, but a populism rooted in division. I think the path to victory for us is to tap into that progressive populism that's rooted in the thinking that we all do better when we all do better. And if we lean into that and fight for policies that are going to get us in that direction, we're going to see a shift to the left. And I think we'll see more of our candidates winning.
Yeah, that's great. And we got to wrap it up here for today. But I'm always reminded of the great Chris Hedges, the Pulitzer Prize winning author. And to paraphrase, and maybe I'll put his actual quote up on screen here, but he basically said the Democratic Party has moved to the right, and that has pushed the Republicans to crazy. I mean, that's what happened to the Republicans. That's why they're crawling through the windows of the U.S. Capitol out there. And here sits the Democratic Party in what would have been considered right-wing Republican land. My God, Robert Ray would have been a left-wing Democrat probably here in the state of Iowa. But we're out of time today. I digress. We get into other topics. But on this water issue now, to wrap up here, and maybe this would be a good time to remind people how to join the fight, Adam, how to get involved with you. Wrap up here for us and put in your pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to thank you again for having me, George. For folks that are interested in water quality or any other number of issues, you can find us online at iowacci.org. We're on all of the social media too. Sign up for our emails. That'll get you up to speed on these issues and give you lots of ways to take action so that we're cleaning up our air, our water, and our communities.
Well, he's the guy. That's the group. I mean, like I said, we're looking for champions, and Iowa CCI is a champion. Folks, that's Adam Mason. He's the state policy director for the Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, and he lives in Des Moines, and that's the downstream portion of the Raccoon River watershed. So he's in this with us, folks. Adam, thanks again for coming on a podcast by George.
Thanks for having me, George. Appreciate it.
And folks, if you like Podcast by George, if you like this perspective, if you like hearing from folks like Adam Mason, who don't get a platform in a lot of places, please support Podcast by George. Go to YouTube, subscribe there, ring the notification bell, like us on Facebook so that you get to hear folks like Adam Mason. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.